afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mmabatho Matiwane. I work for Petro SA, which is a South African national oil company. I'm based in Cape Town, that's why I'm wearing boots today. It's a bit chilly. We are going to be having this session. It's mainly on focusing around compliance. And I think just to make it a little bit more interactive, we'll also be taking questions from the floor. So if you've got any questions that you would like to pose to the panel, as the chair of this session, I would like to invite your comments from the floor. Without wasting too much time, I think what I would also like to do is, we open this forum, I would like to give each panel to welcome all of you. Please give your best, and thank you for making time. But I'll start with giving you guys an opportunity just to introduce yourself briefly, tell people what you do in your daily, everyday job, so that people can also know who is here, what you do, because we are also looking at expanding networks and maybe coaching and mentoring opportunities for those who would like to. Over to you. We'll start with the thorn amongst the roses.
Thank you very much. As I was introduced, my name is Krishna, Govender. I'm at a private business school, Regenesys Business School. We offer programs in management and leadership. And the uniqueness of our MBA and post program is that we've integrated spiritual leadership and emotional intelligence into all our programs. The business school was started by a former monk who served the communities in Orange Farm for many years, and then he decided that he needs to give more to the communities and started the Regenesys Business School with the motto that we need to awaken potential in individuals and unlock potential. So this is the theme that runs through our entire program. Thank you.
Thanks. Dionne, maybe.
My name is Dionne Kerr. I run a consulting business called Siyakha Consulting. We have had the privilege of advising companies in Black economic empowerment since 1999, and have been through quite a journey during the last 14 years. Key for us as a business is we help to businesses to understand that this concept of Black economic empowerment is not a black-white thing, but rather an operating ethos. And I travelled extensively overseas to encourage businesses and multinational businesses to continue to invest in South Africa, and to do it in such a way where they bring their global expertise, but in a way that makes commercial sense for them, and specifically local relevance in South Africa. So I also sit as the vice chairperson of the National Association of BBBEE Consultants, and I head the ethics and discipline portfolio around BBBEE practices within the South African market.
Thank you. I think I was introduced this morning, but just specifically what I do in the policy development process in the public service. We have also developed the frameworks that I mentioned, which are the step-by-step tools to assist department in implementing these policies. And unlike you who report to Department of Labour only, we also have to report to Cabinet periodically and also to the Portfolio Committee, because government has introduced its own equity targets. And we also provide support to departments, that would seem to be having difficulties because their expertise resides at the DPSA.
Rose Nkosi, work for Sasol, Sasol Limited, employing about 30,000 employees in South Africa and about 6,000 employees internationally. And so I'm responsible for global diversity and RSA transformation. And when I say global diversity and RSA transformation, I talk about employment equity, BBBEE, the EE pillar, skills development pillar, and so forth. But I also talk about partnerization, which is an equivalent to employment equity. Talk about localization, which is an equivalent to employment equity in Mozambique. So all sorts of regulatory compliance. If you're in South Africa, you comply with South African regulations.
Thank you. So panel members. Sis Rose, maybe let me start with you. Sasol is one of the good companies that we are all looking at. And currently, you guys have just been listed on the stock exchange. If you were to be the MD of Sasol, how would you define diversity today?
Actually, I don't live by definitions. You know the famous saying that Jesus is the answer, but what is the question? So when you talk about, when you say I must define diversity, what is the question? And it is the question that I asked any leader to say, what is it about diversity which is your responsibility that you don't understand? And that's the question that and so you can throw words like employment equity, diversity, inclusion, equal opportunities, affirmative action. It is in the deeds. It is in the practice and the implementation of this inclusive culture in the way how we do things around this place when no one else is watching.
I think what I would like to hear from you, give me an example of those deeds. Yeah, share with us. What are those deeds?
Okay.
Yeah, at Sasol.
If you talk, this session is around compliance, right?
Yep. But can we possibly also think outside compliance?
Okay, I wanted you to give me that permission.
Yes, I am.
Because now and thank you for that permission. When we talk about substantive compliance, that is the qualitative measures that you need to do as an organization, it's around the bread and butter issues of people that work in this place. And therefore, you need to take it at a different level and say, how do you integrate diversity into your normal HR processes from recruitment till exit of an individual in the organization? When you do your workforce planning, exactly how do you plan the future, the size, the profile of this organization? So it starts right at the beginning. When you do your recruitment and selection, what is the scoring matrix that you utilize to actually make sure that you favor the underrepresented groups? We do not talk blacks. We do not, that suitcase word called blacks, we don't use it anymore. It's around the economically active population and therefore who is the most underrepresented group. And so your selection matrix must talk to that matrix. So in terms of deeds, we go into detail around even the succession management pool that we're talking about. Exactly what is the profile? Why did you wait until an individual is 45 years in the organization, and that's the tenure of people in Sasol? 45 years, and then you say, sorry, there is no skill outside in the labor market. There's only this one individual who is 45 years in this organization who can do the job, but I didn't do anything to make sure that there is a healthy pipeline. I don't know how much time you have, because I can go to town. Okay.
Give us a moment.
Just to branch over to, for example, people with disabilities. As I'm preaching this gospel, I'm not ever preaching the gospel that Sasol is there. Not a chance. There's still a journey. And when it comes to people with disabilities, you know the motto. Nothing about us without us. Okay. So the whole jargon around inclusion is actually saying, how do we engage people to make sure that they are part of the conversation and not think about people with disabilities without them in the room?
Yeah. Thank you. I'd like to bring in Barbara on this one, from the public service perspective. What Rose is saying is that the emphasis is saying the black suitcase, and from government's perspective, we know that's where the emphasis is still at. Can I hear your comment in response to exactly that? Is this the time where we can say what she's saying, or what is your perspective?
You know, if you think the public service is the single largest employer in the country, she's talking about a few thousand. We employ 1.3 million people in the public service. This is the scope of work. One of the reasons why we still retain the suitcase, as you would call it, is that apartheid had differential impacts on those inside that suitcase. Those inside that suitcase were coloureds, were Indians, were Africans. And each of those groups were impacted differently, with the Africans the worst. African women worse than everybody else. An African woman with disability right at the bottom of the grave. So if you really want to measure the progress within this large group, I think that is why, even though as South African citizens, you often get very angry when you go to government offices, you find that it still asks you to take India or whatever. I don't think it's because we still have our foot in 394. I think part of it is the realization that the previous system had differential impacts. And you therefore have to do a differential way of monitoring. Otherwise, you remember with education during Model C times, when the schools would say, you must have so many black people, what the historically white schools would then do would use colours and Indians to fill the quota. And instead of addressing the Africans where the real need lies. And I think for us in the public service, that's the reason why we still use those differential groups, so that we are able to see, is Department X, for example, that seem to have the DG that looks like the minister, and therefore all senior managers are like the minister and the DG. You know, that in-group, out-group I was talking about. Because part of diversity is that they have an expression in Afrikaans, they say, soort soek soort. A type looks for a type. So that is why we do that differentiation still.
Okay, so the suitcase. Dionne, I'd like you to share your perspective, especially coming from a consulting entity.
I think that the advantage you have as a consultant is that when you pull a boardroom together and you tell them what they need to do, you come at it from a business perspective and they listen because they're paying you for that piece of advice. When you're in corporate transformation and you motivate a case, there are so many other bureaucratic business agendas that come into play in the way in which we address the issue of transformation. And I always feel that it is more difficult, actually, for transformation executives to drive change than it is for most other executives to effect change, be it financial, be it organizational, etc. But I think for me, in our experience and the advantage that we've had of seeing diversity unfold over the last 14 years in South Africa is that I always caution businesses to be careful around the messaging that we create in diversity. Because the concept of diversity is inclusion. The concept of diversity is that, and the role of women in business is the same role that women have in society, is that we make sure that nobody gets left behind. So the role of a woman in community is to make sure that the elderly and the men and our collective group of women and our children are all taken care of. And it has always traditionally been that role of woman. And I think that we must be careful around the messaging in diversity and inclusion to not be anti-men or anti-age, aged, professional, qualified individuals in our society. Because the negative impact is that people will start to feel more excluded and not more included. So I guess for us from a consulting standpoint, we believe very much, as Gail indicated in Accenture, about creating an environment of inclusivity. I think, as Rose alluded to, it's very much about making sure that you follow beautiful corporate governance, HR best practice. And HR best practice is about growth, making sure you have the right people and making sure you don't discriminate against anyone. And by default, that should address the issues of employment equity. But in saying that, I think, as Barbara has indicated, we have a very, very long way to go. If we look at the graduates coming out of university right now, they are in the majority black. However, if you talk to a black child that lives outside of a city or urban area in South Africa and have a conversation about maths and science, their conversation in their minds is about food and about survival. And it's not about maths and science and going to work in mining. When you talk to youth in South Africa about what will they do when they finish school, they have no concept of wanting to go into mining or agriculture, because their only reference point is being a mine worker or a farm labourer. So we have to start to have different conversations as business with different sectors of the community, and we have to address the disparities that exist between previously disadvantaged South Africans and the currently disadvantaged South Africans that are living in our, and that have become almost our majority today.
Okay, I'd like to bring in the professor now, especially from a training institution perspective. What Dionne is saying, how do we address those fundamentals?
Yeah, definitely. Training institutions have an important role to play, but I'd like to pick up the training institution cap just for a few seconds to say, those people come to the leadership training and the MBAs and what have you. They digest what is imparted, and my concern is how much of that is transformed out there and adapted. Because I get the sense that they do the module, they do the training course, they pass the exams. It's very theoretical. But out there, the concept of diversity, transformation, inclusivity, etc., have to be adapted in a way that, you draw from your theory, no doubt, but the reality on the ground shouldn't be forgotten.
Prof, are you trying to say, I've heard a lot of people, especially people who come for MBA, they say it's a life-changing experience. I don't know whether you've heard people say that. So I want you to talk about that in terms of, I hear you saying that they come in, they come in as Mmabatho with my whole baggage, but the role of training institutions in changing that life and making sure that by the time I go out back to my environment, I'm a change agent that will make the impact. So please just address us at that level.
No, sure. Definitely, training institutions have a very important role to play in ensuring that when we get a group, whether it's online virtual group of people coming together, or whether you get a group coming together by contact, to when they engage with each other, they all engage from the same level. We have a diverse group sitting there, and by the time they complete the program, we are hoping that they've learned certain values, which they could go out there now try to implement to say, we have come from individual backgrounds, but we go back as a group, understanding how the group needs to function.
Do you mind just touching a little bit on your spiritual journey that you take them through?
Not a spiritual journey as such, but we speak about spiritual leadership.
Yes.
It's not about religion per se.
Yep.
It's about understanding that you have a greater purpose as a leader, as a manager, whatever, to awaken the potential in others that you lead, to identify that everyone has value to add. And this is the thing which I impart, that you need to ensure that when you are in leadership position, people out there are looking up to you, right? To unpack the potential that's in there, not to regard them as being subservient.
Yeah. Barbara?
Thanks. You see, the spirituality that he's talking about, I think we see manifested in different ways. In the business world, I could say the King's Report and the King's Code, he talks about being a responsible citizen. As an employer, what does it entail? For us in the public service, it's issues of ethics, integrity, and honesty. So these values exist somewhere. I do not ever feel that, sometimes, they say South Africa is a country of 2-in-1. The dichotomy in South Africa is something very interesting, because even when we look at how we perceive transformation, the private sector has got a very different way of perceiving it to the public sector. In the public service, it is quite normal to say practices are racist. But sitting at the table today, I was sitting with some young professionals who were actually talking about this hostile environment in the workplace, particularly around senior managers who are not prepared to let go of their old thinking.
Just hold it there, thank you. I'd like to bring in Sasol here.
Yes.
Your experience of exactly what he's talking about, because there is that perception that the private sector is very hostile when coming to deal with those issues.
I'm not quite sure. This is a timely conversation around diversity. I don't think I want my children to be sitting here talking about this. But in terms of hostility, you've got different levels of consciousness when it comes to diversity. And at certain areas, you will find that the level of consciousness is really there. But you'll find in other areas, it's just not there.
Give us
And so that is why we utilize the ethics line. We've got an ethics line where employees actually call anonymously to report issues of racism, of discrimination, of unfair treatment, disrespect, and just lack of dignity. And that is where employees will offload. And so it is there. But it is dealt with, and that is why there is that open ethics line where people report these issues. And I'm able to draw per business unit the issues that came out of that business unit from the ethics line. And the managing director of that ethics line is handed the issues of that business unit so that they are dealt with at source. And so I cannot say that just the private sector is hostile. It is everywhere. It is everywhere. It's how you deal with it. How you create a zone of uncomfortable debate. And this zone of uncomfortable debate is created by dialogue. And that is what we purport. Using ethics line reports, using our engagement, we have an engagement survey to just survey the engagement level of employees in the organization, and we call it the heartbeat. It's the heartbeat survey. It tells us where employees are at. It tells us how we are managing, valuing, or celebrating diversity. It tells us employees who are feeling marginalized, because it is our duty and our role to manage the fears of the one group and the aspirations of the other group. You cannot do employment equity, diversity, or inclusion at the expense of other groups. And therefore, it is our role and our duty to do that. And compliance is the foundation of that. You cannot say numbers are not important. Of course they are important. Numbers are important as the substantive compliance issues. Because, in fact, legislation expresses itself in numbers. That's the only way the regulator will know that this organization is transforming or not, because it expresses itself in numbers.
Dionne, thank you. I just want to find that it's easy for us now, the public, to scrutinize big companies like Sasol. Small companies, that employs less than 30 people. How do you handle exactly the same issue that she's articulated? Because Sasol is visible, it can't hide.
I think the fundamental of all of this is that it comes down to your ethos. It fundamentally becomes about who you are. I always say that if today, in the year 2013, you are not transformed, then it is because you have been working hard at that. To not have achieved any level of transformation in the year 2013 has to have been a key focus, because it is impossible not to now be employing women and people with disabilities and a diverse workforce that includes people who are black and from rural areas and from urban city centres. It is impossible to do so. And whilst we are nowhere near the ideal, one of the problems I have with compliance, and we work very closely with the DTI around the BEE codes of good practice, by the way, which the new draft codes are going to be announced any day now, and there is a DTI public summit on the 3rd and 4th of October, so please be there if you can register online. But the point about BEE is that it was never intended to be a long-term imperative in South Africa. It was always intended to be a 10-year policy, and the reason why it was only going to be a 10-year policy, and the reason it was necessary, is because South African business invested so much money in hiring really clever advisors on how to circumvent transformation, that they were doing more to circumvent it than they were to implement it. And therefore, we needed a balanced scorecard and a common way of measuring it so that we could see how far we've come. The challenge I have in South Africa is we are so compliance-driven. What happens when that 10-year policy or legislation comes to an end? Do we have a changed hearts and minds? Do we have people that feel connected around what it means to be South African? Maybe let's take the question. Thank you. Let's give the question to Prof.
Yeah, I just want to add something.
Yes.
The whole issue of compliance. Yes, compliance is necessary, was necessary, and will still be necessary. However, business schools and education institutions have an important role to play to kind of move people from a compliance mode to a conviction mode. And that is going to take some time, now we're just keeping above the law, as it were. But business schools have the responsibility, I think, and Regenesys is doing a good job in ensuring that when we impart knowledge, as much as we refer to the legislation, but we try to get our cores, our groupings, to understand that it should be internalized. These things should be internalized, because this is the kind of practice we have at Regenesys. We don't have a scorecard. Okay, we have certain compliance issues, but we're growing as well. And then we realize that we need now, it's just by default we have women in most of the leadership positions, all those things. But as the organization is growing, the point you made about small organizations, that you need to now look at your map and look at representation and look at ensuring that there's equal opportunity for all people from diverse grouping backgrounds, etc.
Sister Rose, is it really by default? I see you are like,
No.
You're not, I see you, you're saying something.
I think the reason why legislation comes into place, it's because we fail in our duty to do the right thing, ethically. And therefore things are regulated. Therefore we get a legislation. A simple thing, like income disparities, that is regulated. When I report to the Department of Labour, I report on income disparities. We continue to pay people unequally. So equal pay for equal work job is very, very important. And we hide behind even our policies. We even breach our policies, where we underpay. When we really scrutinize, you just realize, how was this individual paid so low coming into this organization when his counterparts doing exactly the same job, the same experience are up there. You want to question that. And therefore you want to query why there is legislation. Legislation is needed because we are far from maturity when it comes to diversity. We need it to be legislated until it is institutionalized and internalized. It might take 30 years to do that, but it's got to be done.
Thank you. Mrs. Barbara, please come in. Are we really that far? Are we really that far? What are the reports telling us now?
Well, I'm going to be speaking now in my capacity as a commissioner, the Commissioner of Employment Equity. You quite right, Rose. You know, one of the projects that we are working on now is the revision of the Employment Equity Act. Because the hostile environment that I was talking about, you know, the reports that we are getting from companies in terms of employment equity, we hear these statements that people were not able to implement their equity plans because they can't find these black people, they can't find these women, they can't find these disabled people.
Yeah.
Please help us identify the rock we can lift and let them come out. And if that is the case, you see the logic is that if you can't find women, when we look at your report on skills development and all of that, that money should manifest in that kind of expenditure. But the interesting thing that we see in companies, which is contradictory to what they say, is that that training budget is often spent on the white, who are supposed to be the managers and able. So how do you understand this? That the group that is already in senior position and skilled is still getting the money for development. So it's either you've promoted them and they are actually not capable, and you've left out the capable ones, or, like I said this morning, employment practices, if they are unchecked for diversity, you end up employing your type of people. Or is it the perpetuation of the past?
I'm always amazed with, especially at corporate, at senior management, because it's always males who say they can't find women.
Precisely.
Especially for work purposes. By the way, I was just saying that, by the way, I'm always amazed.
Yeah. I just wanted to give an example. We talk about the challenges of finding black skills. In 2005, we did a project for one of the big pharmaceutical companies. And we sat in front of their board, which was a global board, who said, we would hire black people and we can't find them. They just don't exist. We've looked and we've looked and we've tried and they don't exist. So as part of our exercise, because I love a challenge and I love to be right. So I said, if I find them, will you guarantee you'll hire them? And we did an exercise and we collaborated quite closely with Honest to Quote and the training institutions. And what we discovered was that the black veterinary scientists who had qualified went back into farms and farming communities. They came from farming communities, they went back to live with their parents and into farming communities. And we found 22 black, this is 9 years ago, 22 black veterinary scientists qualified living in farming communities. Now the reason that this business couldn't find them was because their advertising and recruitment practices are all geared around Johannesburg Sunday Times. Now if I'm a farmer in Witbank, I ain't reading the Sunday Times, and certainly not if I'm a rural farmer. And so this comes about what Rose was saying earlier in that it has to pull through into the way in which we do business. We have to consider how we do business, who we do business with, and who benefits from the business we do. And that includes starting to look at non-traditional mechanisms to attract, develop, and retain skills.
Okay, can I just maybe bring the thought here? When you deal with your applications, do you factor those in? What Dionne was saying?
In terms of recruitment?
Yes. Because I know sometimes, I'm just curious to find out how do you deal with the issues that Dionne is highlighting in terms of attracting the right students, if I were to put it, in that way.
You mean recruiting students or recruiting staff?
Students.
Oh, well, being a private institution, we advertise why we need to recruit. We need as many students as possible.
Yeah, that's exactly why I'm asking the question.
It's widely advertised. I mean, I think the point she's making is very valid in terms of which media you're using. We use radio, we use various forms of media, but we haven't had a specific targeted advertising focusing on particular media as such.
And why not? I'm just curious, why not?
Okay, let me take you one step back.
Like, for example,
you go to school,
we'd like to have 80% of black female students coming into our institution. Is that not possible? That's what I'm...
Yeah, I think from a private institution perspective is different from the public's. With the private institution perspective is that, we need the numbers. Irrespective of who you are. You understand? So we'll recruit as widely as possible. So I don't think there'll be any certain kind of targeted recruitment. Nevertheless, where you might question is that when we go to schools, which schools do we target? So we've got a balance of the township schools and the city schools.
Okay, so it is addressed. Okay.
I was just going to say, in the corporate environment, even our bursary intake, we go to universities and that's where we source our candidates. Even in our sourcing strategy, we want to make sure that the profile of those candidates is going to enable us to change the profile of the organization. And therefore, there is no gateway that is not closed when it comes to employment equity and making sure, right from the talent sourcing strategy. So our bursary intake, the most underrepresented groups coming.
Sis Barbara, you want to say something?
Yes. Around this targeted recruitment, what we are now encouraging departments to do is, particularly for disability, if your department has not reached 1% of the required 2%, part of the remedial plans that you have to submit to us at DPSA, for example, we would want to know which are the civil society organizations that deal with disability are you working with? Women's groups, because we are now saying particularly with disability, because disabilities are so diverse. It's the visual and this, the way we advertise would not necessarily reach all disabled people. So we're beginning to say to the department, every department has to have some kind of partnership and relationship with organizations for people with disabilities, so that they are able to assist you to recruit from that particular group here.
Wanting to move the country forward as change agents, is South Africa ready to deal with the issues of gays, lesbians, transgender, like we saw at Station? Are we ready? Because currently the emphasis, there's a lot of emphasis on black, female, youth, disabled. And we see all the time in the media, TV, we read on the newspaper, violence against gays, violence against lesbians. Are we ready to deal with those in our workplace? Sasol?
I don't think it's an issue of readiness. Yeah. We will never be ready. It's not about readiness. It is about this culture of inclusivity. the values that bind, which is the glue that binds you as the entity, the organization, that determine the temperature and the conduciveness of the environment. We have gays and lesbians and people who have, transitioned, so to speak, and that is why we work with them, and so and people live with it. Some will outwardly say, I am gay, and there's nothing different about them, and we do understand them. It's like people with disabilities, exactly the same, and hence the whole issue around the emphasis on providing reasonable accommodation instead of focusing on the disability, focus on what else can the individual do. And it's similar to gender equity. Gender equity, we've driven that to its nth degree. But believe you me, women, we are a problem even in our own selves. When we surveyed the women in our organization, we asked them, what would you like this women's network to do? Some women said, we want you to focus on career growth. Another group said, we want flexible work-life balance. Another group said, actually, we don't want any of those. We want to be giving back to the community. Another group said, we want to have nothing to do with this coffee session, women's network thing. And that's the reality. It is. Either because they have arrived, and just the perception that I'm the first one here and the last one here, and no one else will ever follow, and therefore kick the step ladder so that no one comes up the ladder. And that is something that we need to have a conversation about as women ourselves. Before we even bring men into the conversation, we need to sort out our yard. Barbara?
Madam Chair? I must defend the women that you are allowing. I think the women that you are describing, I think as a gender activist, my view is that if you live in a country such as ours, where we've been socialized to believe that women are not good enough to be leaders, where we know that women are instruments and you can only find them at a certain time and not find them certain times, all of us assimilate that culture. Men and women. Women that say that the other women are no good, it isn't because women are no good. I think it's because they haven't been conscientized enough to understand why do women behave like that. And I really do believe that women are a diverse group, and therefore their needs will be equally diverse. If in a workplace some want to be integrated, some feel they have arrived, it's okay. There are men who don't care a hoot about men that are down there. Just because someone is a woman, it's not necessarily an advocate for women's rights. We would love it to be that, but if they are not advocates, we have to help them to see the light and become their ultimately. So, but I really do feel that sometimes women are judged unfairly, and it is simply because they are only acting out what they have been socialized to believe.
Yeah. In closing, can I have two suggestions from each one of you in how we take this issue of diversity forward?
I personally believe that if you're a South African and you think you can deal with diversity without looking at the impact of the past in the way we do things and the way we relate, you are not going to get it right.
That's one.
Yes.
Second?
And the second one, I think, you with the principles, the values that underpin this whole process.
Okay, thank you. Dionne?
Two things. I think my advice to companies and employers would be to not focus too much on the things that you can't do. It's very easy to become intimidated by amazing programs that are being delivered elsewhere. And before you shoot for glory, do something simple, do it really well, achieve results, and you will be amazed at how results will create a sense of collaboration within your organization. My second advice would simply be, and as the team that work with me know, I always say this, that if you want to be treated differently, then act differently.
Thank you. That's fair. If you want to be treated differently, act differently. Be the change that you want to see.
Yes, thanks. From an education institution perspective, I think the point our first speaker mentioned is that education has an important role to play in terms of socializing people into believing not what we were previously kind of socialized to believe that we are women or what disabled we are, we are lower category or whatever it is, but we all have potential, right? So institutions and business schools, particularly training business leaders, have a important role to play in that they need to ensure that diversity is embraced not necessarily only for compliance, but it has to be internalized and has to be kind of cascaded throughout the organization and become the culture of the organization.
Thank you, Prof.
I think for me, if we keep on doing the same thing and expect a different result, it's a definition of madness. There's a gentleman, Mr. Porter, he was in one of the syndicate groups. He kept on saying, we have to push the envelope. I hope you're still here, because that resonates with me a lot. You have to do something fundamentally different from the norm in order to achieve diversity and inclusion in this country. And if you're scared, you don't have the courage to really push this envelope, you will not get the share of wealth that we now need in this country. So that's the one thing that I push the envelope. Number two, people that are here might not be the leaders that we are supposed to be talking to. It's the wrong audience for this conversation. The real audience that's supposed to be in this room is actually absent.
Yes.
And I really would like to send an invitation to the organizers of such events to call the real leadership, because that is where the fish rots from the top, Richard Barrett said so. And therefore we really need to fundamentally hit it right at the top for this need to happen.
Thank you. Can I just request that we take 2 questions from the floor?
Yes, indeed. Yeah. In fact, that is exactly what I was going to say. But before we get there, I think it's only appropriate that we ask Madam Chair what her 2 comments also are. You guys agree? Over to you, Madam Chair.
I think my 2 comments is I'm going to possibly steal from Rose. Let's not do the same thing over and over again and expect to get a different result. I've seen quite a lot of those in South Africa, in all our practices. We shift people, we change organizations, we change positions, but the practices don't change. The second one would be, let's just do one thing at a time and get that right. Because sometimes we try and address the whole scorecard, and we miss the whole 7 element. So I think that if you're passionate about making sure that diversity, you address the issue of people with disability, focus on that and get that one right. Thank you.
Focus and change the things that are not working. So now the floor is open. Madam Chair has asked if we focus on 2 questions. I think we can get 3 questions in, because it was a healthy, wonderful discussion, and I know we pressed for time, so if we can get 3 questions in, I think we're going to try and do that. So the mic is right at the back there. So ladies first, please, gentlemen, I think you're aware of this.
Thank you, panel, for a very interesting discussion. My name is Olivia. I'm actually from a legal background. So my question is going to be more around, or more from a labor law perspective. In terms of us, all of us here are HR managers, but if we go back to the labor courts and look how they actually apply affirmative action, it's actually very shocking. If I take, for example, the recent Barnard case, where the labor courts are saying the white applicant takes preference over black applicants. And then if you look at other cases, like the Stoneman case, that case actually says you've got to look at South Africa, the past injustice, you've got to look at apartheid. But Rose, I think you would know, currently in Cape Town, there's a big case, it's the February case that's in the Labour Court, where there's actually even further disparities now between black, Indian, and coloured people. And I just feel from a compliance perspective, this goes against the very creation of the Employment Equity Act. So I'd like to get the panel's view on, you know, if HR practitioners can't get it right, if the labour courts can't get it right, then what should we actually do?
Can we take another question?
Yes, I think what we'll do is perhaps if we get another question also, let's get the 3 questions and then we'll get the panelists to discuss those 3 questions. So please repeat next question, sir.
Can you hear me? Oh, okay. I'm starting it. I'm working for Coca, starting a new section, diversity. It is always my question. I always ask myself several questions before I start. So I'll go back a little bit and focus basically on disability. Not that I'm not having a disability. Government is talking about 2% that we should employ people with disability, 2%. But the real thing is that accidents and sicknesses are happening beyond 2%. What is the role that government would play, or any private sector, any company in the private sector would play, in ensuring that the 2%, to my understanding, doesn't adequately include everyone with a disability. So how can we deal with that challenge that we are currently having? Thank you very much.
Thank you, great question. I think we'll take the 3rd question. Did the panelists get the question down so that we just know? Okay, so there's one more at the back.
My question basically is, you know, when we are having this kind of shows, we describe these things and we have positive feedback about these things that will happen in terms of monitoring and evaluating this organization. What is it the government that is doing currently that is going to be different, whereby the government is going to be hands on deck to check the issues of compliance, especially in the issues of career development of women, designated groups. I need to find out what is the government doing in terms of monitoring and evaluating, because it's not worth it for us all the time to be talking about these issues when we are here and we speak about them. These things have to cascade down to a level where the people actually do the actual work. What is the government going to do to evaluate and to monitor and to be strict in terms of compliance, in terms of legislation?
Madam Chair, I think that's a question, so please feel free to delegate the questions.
I want to you for it. I'm still sharing.
No, please, that's you're the boss. You are the boss.
Okay, maybe can we ask Sis Barbara? monitoring and evaluation. What is government doing here?
Yes, I think I'll take that one as well as the one before.
Yep.
The 2%.
Yes, the 2%.
They are the ones. I'll start with the first one, the 2%. You know, the 2% was determined around 95, 96, where I believe they looked at the economically active population. But low as the percentage is, the sad part is that we're still not even reaching it. We have been having debates actually in the public service together with the Department of Women, Children and People with Disabilities, asking ourselves, is this 2% perhaps not too low to the extent that you don't have to plan for it? Shouldn't we raise it? Because if you increase it, you now have to plan for it and not just expect it to happen by accident. So yes, we are discussing this, and I think very seriously the Deputy Minister, Henrietta Mokopane Zulu, is very actively involved in the debate because we really are concerned about that. And I think after the election, because between now and elections, there's hardly going to be any policy changes in the public service. If we're looking for policy changes, it will probably be post-election time. And then in terms of compliance around monitoring, you know that the issue of compliance with the Employment Equity Act, the responsibility resides with the Department of Labour. And for us at DPSA, the responsibility to implement that in the public service resides with us. So we've also been having discussions with the Department of Labour that, first of all, many government departments are not complying themselves. So if departments do not comply, how difficult does it make it for Minister Oliphant, for example, to come down heavily on the private sector? And from the Commission of Employment Equity, we then recommended to the Department of Labour that they should actually start doing DG visits to the departments, just like they do with businesses. Second example, and if you were to find a department, for example, how are you going to pay that fine? Because according to the PFMA, you can't pay a non-compliance fine with money from the fiscus. You know. Yeah. So, and there are all sorts of things that we have put in place. For example, as I said in the morning, beginning to hold Directors General accountable for that. Yes. Minister Timwana, when we presented that report to Cabinet, actually said to the President that day, Mr. President, the next round of performance agreements that you enter with ministers now, you actually have to hold ministers accountable. Because you see, the wedding cake in the public service, if you hold a minister accountable, minister is going to hold DG accountable, and that's how it gets done. So again, it seems like we're shifting the goalpost to post-election, but it would seem that some of the new monitoring, tight monitoring tools will be a little better articulated after the election.
Thank you. There was also the first question.
I think Rose went.
Rose, the passing the back.
I will attempt to answer the question as much as I can, that is if I understood you very well. And it stemmed from the dissatisfaction around just the word that I called blacks, a suitcase word, and why we really need to actually segment and unpack the word blacks from an economically active population. And this is what the EE Act requires. And when you follow that very carefully, it requires us to determine the most underrepresented groups. Of the designated groups that are reflected in the Act, which is Africans, coloureds, Indians, people with disabilities, and white women as well, when the implementation started, we tended to open the tap for white women and for Indian people that came in. So the tap was open, and that was very good. The passion that went into that was incredible. And we are saying we want the same passion, that same energy that was used when we brought in the brilliant white ladies, the brilliant Indian ladies and men that came in. We would like the same energy to be put in place for the most underrepresented groups, which is the Africans and coloureds, invariably. And when we set targets, and we put our employment equity plan, we say to the government, based on this reality, we realize that there's now overrepresentation of this particular segment, and we'd like to slow down and retain the cream that we have, and slow down in this area and bring up the most underrepresented groups. It's really done in faith, in good faith. But it's up to the organization also to create this understanding and conviction to make all parties understand why we do things the way we do them.
Thank you. Sorry, can I just add to that very quickly? I think, Olivia, also some of your question was around consistency in the legislation and the application of that legislation, and how do practitioners muddle their way through the fact that there are inconsistencies in the way in which the labour law is applied. I think exactly the same question comes up when we talk about the Black Economic Empowerment legislation, in that we have PPPFA regulations, the new IPAP regulations which follow localization, local content, and the BEE legislation, and then 10 sector codes sitting underneath the BEE legislation, all of which have equal standing in law. So dependent on how and who you are doing business with, the interpretation of that can be applied and addressed differently. And I think that a lot of your question is around that issue. My only answer to that in businesses and practitioners comes back to, and it feels like a very soft issue, but hopefully it answers your question, is that it has to be, there are so many loopholes and grey areas that you could use to find an excuse not to do something. If your intent is right, if your understanding of what we are trying to achieve in South Africa is right, and your policies and your processes are congruent and transparent, then by rights you should be in a position to motivate or stand before a judge and convince them that you went about issues with the right intention. In Black Economic Empowerment, the BEE Amendment Bill has now introduced a BEE trumping clause, which says that in the absence of clarity or contradiction with any other piece of legislation, BEE will trump that legislation. And the intention around that is to try and provide certainty around what we are required to do. But the issue has to be about, do we act with integrity? And that's what it comes down to, because there will always be somebody or a group of people or an organization or a loophole in the legislation, which means we can duck and dive and get around it. And we have to move ahead with integrity, and that's really the only test that you can give yourself.
Thank you very much. That's where we say the conversation shall continue. Madam Chair, thank you for a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much to all of you.